Hello everyone, and welcome to the last SSP webinar of the year. This Scholarly Kitchen SSP webinar is the future of publisher independence in the consolidated scholarly ecosystem. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased that you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and hear from our moderator and panelists. You'll be seeing the SSP splash screen while we start this session. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature to send in your questions, or if you need to let us know that you're having any technical difficulties, you'll find it in the bar on the right side of your screen. The moderator will review questions and present them to the panelists. To help her, please specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed, and also please send in your questions as we go instead of waiting till the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar. Our moderator today is Angela Cochran, the Associate Publisher and Journals Director for the American Society of Civil Engineers, publisher of 36 technical journals. Prior to that, she was the production director at ASCE, overseeing all production aspects of journals, a monthly member magazine, and book products. She is president-elect of SSP and past president of the Council of Scientific Editors. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Angela so that she can introduce the panel and get us started.
Good morning. I guess we're now at afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Jeff. Our webinar today will be a discussion on the future of independent publishing in a consolidated scholarly market. We will have time to include questions from you, so please do so, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. There have been a growing number of posts in the Scholarly Kitchen about the consolidation we see in the industry. Hold on one second, because I can't. There we go. The consolidation we see in the industry. This consolidation has come in a number of ways. Publishers merging, a growing number of societies partnering with commercial publishers, and now publishers acquiring the infrastructure and the once publisher agnostic vendors we depend on. Some mergers and acquisitions serve a need. Elsevier needed a submission system. Wiley needed a platform. Others serve as an important strategy for the big publishers. Namely, they need to get bigger. Not only that, they need to diversify their profit centers. One way to do this is to provide users, in this case authors, with end-to-end workflow solutions. A publisher that can offer tools necessary at the very beginning of the research process can make it easier for authors to stay in the family, so to speak, with tools for data collection, documentation of protocols, collaboration, discovery, publication in various stages of the process, and post-publication engagement, promotion, and evaluation. Some of these tools may be purchased by individuals, some by institutions. All of them allow a fair bit of data collection that the publishers can use for selling analytic services. So now that the strategies are becoming clear, what does this mean for smaller for-profit publishers, independent society publishers, and university presses that wish to remain independent but may find themselves outpriced or paying their competitors for services? What does it mean for the institutions that are already pushing back on big deals in publisher pricing? Today, I'm joined by three colleagues with different ideas about where to go from here. Let me take a minute to introduce our panel. Allison Muddett joined PLOS as CEO in 2017, having previously served as director of the University of California Press and executive vice president at Sage Publications. Her 30 years in publishing also include leadership positions at Blackwell and Taylor & Francis. Allison also serves on the board of directors of SSP and the Center for Open Science. Brian Hole is the founder and CEO of ubiquitypress. One of the key goals of Ubiquity is to enable sustainable and independent open access publishing at university presses, and they currently support over 30 through their partnership network. 2018 has seen the company introduce a customer charter guaranteeing the ongoing operation of the company in the interests of the community, even following an acquisition, and to partner advisory board that oversees the charter. Prior to founding Ubiquity, Brian worked at the British Library and Elsevier and holds a PhD from University College London. Lisa Janicki-Hinchliffe is Professor Coordinator for Information Literary Services and Instruction in the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is also an affiliate faculty member in the University School of Information Sciences. Lisa has presented and published widely on the value of libraries, library assessment, program evaluation, organizational innovation, scholarly communications, publishing, and information literacy. I want to thank you three for participating today. I'd like to start with a question for Allison. Allison, PLOS is dealing with an incredible volume of submissions and published papers across the portfolio of journals. PLOS seems to have gone back and forth with the always vexed question of, do we build it or do we buy it? PLOS has been investing in a manuscript submission system that never quite got off the ground. Can you talk a bit about the challenges of building your own infrastructure and what you learned from your recent experiences?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me start by just giving a little bit of brief background. Throughout its 17-year history, PLOS has leaned towards building its own technology infrastructure. And I think this was in part due to the concerns we're talking about here today, but also in large part because the kind of technology it needed, such as a platform that didn't have the cost of authentication or article level metrics, was simply things that didn't exist at the time. PLOS's decision to build its own manuscript submission and workflow system, Aperta, was driven by the same frustrations that I think just about everybody expresses about the current systems out there. They're expensive, they're clunky, authors hate them, and as the saying goes, every little change costs at least $60,000 and takes at least 6 months. And so while we're also a strong supporter of the idea of sort of systems that are developed by the community, there wasn't, and arguably still isn't, anything beyond the large commercial systems that scales to PLOS's volume at this point. So the idea behind Aperta was to develop a more lightweight, flexible, modular, and interoperable system that would not only allow PLOS to run its existing journals more efficiently, but equally importantly for us, would allow us to try new approaches and workflows more rapidly and easily. But when I got to PLOS 15 months ago, we were way over budget and time frame. And so it was one of the areas that I first took a deep dive into. We looked at the code base itself as well as other aspects and made the pretty difficult decision not to continue. That was a really hard decision given everything that had gone into development at that point. And I think in part it was having me come in with an outsider's perspective that enabled us to do that. And arguably, the overarching failure was driven by just the sheer length of time the project had been underway. That said, there were some key lessons that we did learn from that. I think the first of them goes to the code base itself, which ended up being more monolithic and less easily componentized than the original vision. That was in part due to just the number of developers working both within and beyond PLOS. And after 4 years, the underlying technology choices were no longer the best available at this time. We'd also worked using an agile methodology, but its success was compromised by changing and sometimes contradictory requirements. And the solutions to those were often really difficult to recognize because of all the complex interdependencies in the workflow. And I think this goes to the interplay of the challenges of sort of the human elements of development alongside the technology ones. As we dug into this, there were multiple challenges with the people aspects, changes in personnel, lack of clear ownership and accountabilities, and over time, I think a growing sense of frustration among the team who were working on it. It was also very difficult to drive such a significant level of change on an existing business and journal infrastructure. The success of the original vision for Aperta required us to change entrenched behaviors across journal workflows. Things like being able to work within the system rather than work through largely an email communication system. And that was tough for us with just 7 journals. And I think, part of the result of that was somewhere along the line, the end game almost became a feature for feature replacement for Editorial Manager instead of the original vision. So I think that, the short answer to the question that you asked is that we overestimated our own abilities and we underestimated how really difficult it is to build enterprise-wide software, to say nothing of how expensive it is. Going forward, I think we've made a fairly clear decision that we will not be investing alone in the development of this kind of enterprise-wide system. Our future vision has to be one that focuses more on flexibility and integration. And so if we're not building something that's truly distinct and adds unique value for us, we're going to have to work with what's already available or what may become available. And I think that really speaks to some of the challenges of where we are now that we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah, and I think the one of the lessons that we've certainly learned, which others already may have known, is just how difficult some of these systems are. PLOS is certainly not the only organization that has struggled with building their own infrastructure. Elsevier was building its own submission systems before shelving it and buying Aries. Likewise, Wiley had already built a platform that was in need of an overhaul and instead purchased Adapon. Brian, you built your own content and delivery platform. Can you tell us a little bit about ubiquitypress and what your goals are?
Sure. No, we didn't exactly do that, but I'll get into that. So Ubiquity was established to enable the uptake of open access. And the goal there was to provide a quality platform and services at a fair price. And we really didn't feel the legacy publishers were doing that. So we built a company in a very lean fashion with this specialization in mind. And so we're now, because of that, we're profitable with APCs at around a quarter of those for the big publishers. And we provide our platform to university presses, libraries, academic societies, so that they can run their own sustainable open access presses. But what we didn't entirely build our own platform because an absolutely key aspect of this is that we use open source software. So we're completely in on being an open source, fully open source platform. And we're totally dedicated to the open source communities that we're members of now. So this, really significantly keeps the costs down. We don't need to develop and maintain software in-house, especially for things where, as Alison says, we don't add value. These are editorial systems, are things that are used across all publishers. And so we use the Open Journal Systems platform from the Public Knowledge Project for our back-end editorial system. And that covers 90% of our journals at the scale that they run at. And where we have journals that are extra high scale, they're transferred away from a very large publisher or something like that, then we do use systems like Scholar One and so forth. But our goal is to really work with PKP and the open source community to further enhance Open Journal Systems so that it does scale up a lot better. And we're working with a lot of our big journals to do that. At the same time, we use the Haiku system from Sanvera for our institutional and data repositories. In both cases, we form very tight partnerships with those open source communities, and we're totally committed to contributing back all the code to those communities. And then finally, that really helps us with one of our core values, which is that we don't want to lock customers into our platform. When we formed the company, we really wanted to be very much the opposite of the way the large legacy publishers were operating. And so as well as the way we structure our contracts, a partner can really much more easily move away from us if they choose to and remain using the same software and systems. It makes the migration a lot easier, and it gives them a lot more confidence and de-risks the whole partnership.
Yeah, and Alison spoke of scale. Certainly, PLOS One has a high volume of content and not the only journal that PLOS is publishing. And it's one thing to build a bespoke service for a single journal. But as you add in more and more titles with its own needs and quirks, complexity grows as a well-functioning processes might get bogged down. We're seeing some interesting new offerings becoming available, but there are concerns that they may not be able to meet the needs of a publisher like PLOS with its 7 journals, let alone a publisher with dozens or hundreds of titles. Brian, as a vendor partner in this space, how do you see this being addressed?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting close to about 500 journals on the platform now, everything from reasonably large scale journals, publishing several hundred papers a year, which is large on average, down to developing world titles. And well, the key thing is by utilizing the open source platforms and contributing to them, we really ensure that those platforms advance because they have a really wide range of requirements due to a much more diverse community than just us. Like PKP has thousands and thousands and thousands of journals and societies using it. And it's also that when you make changes to these platforms, they have to be done in a very careful way that's validated by that whole community and doesn't make the platform unwieldy for other people because you've specialized it in your own way. And what that really does, much like what Alison was saying again, is that it allows us to focus our development efforts on other parts of the platform where we can really add the most value by doing something unique that only Ubiquity offers. and not focusing in on another editorial management workflow or something like that.
Yeah, and Lisa, libraries and institutions are not immune from some of these issues. beepress, the platform for institutional repositories, was also purchased by Elsevier a while back, and it's been a little over a year since that acquisition. And I wonder if you can tell us about what's happened since then from the library perspective. Has there been a mass exodus? Were the concerns well-founded, or has everyone sort of gotten used to the new normal?
Well, that's a great question, Angela, and I guess I'm going to say that it's possible that the concerns were both well-founded and that everyone has sort of gotten used to the new normal, which does not mean that people are satisfied with the new normal or pleased with it, but that they are, operating within it. So I think we know there's not been a mass exodus, because we would certainly see that. There'd probably be a Scholarly Kitchen blog post about it. But I think that's clear that some of the concerns that were raised at the time of the acquisition, continue to be well-founded, which is the question of what is the future development path. Although, as the leaders of beepress and of Elsevier pointed out, that part of what drove the acquisition was the need for capital in order to build out that platform in a way that libraries and institutions were asking for. So I think within that, we can sort of see some of the tensions that we've already been raising in these different areas, which is the desire for development sometimes means scale, to bring it to our consolidating market here, in order to build out the affordances that people are looking for. And when things can sort of be plugged and played together, so you have interoperability, that's great. But obviously, the tighter integration, essentially the more it becomes just one tool, of course, that's more consolidation, which raises some of those concerns that we've seen. I do know that there are still libraries that are looking to exit, as they say, the beepress environment. I think one of the challenges there is some of the services that beepress was known for, which is why a number of those institutions had gone with beepress, which was the service profile, even more than the technology, is still rather unique. And so how you decouple, if you will, the need for the kind of services that beepress provided as a platform from the technology of that platform, and in not just needing the technical infrastructure and abilities that beepress offered, but also some of those more service profile approaches that made it particularly a very good choice for those smaller institutions, where they could sort of buy not just a platform, but a set of services with it. So I don't think that everyone's gotten used to it in the sense that they're satisfied, but I do think that, I don't think we're going to see a mass exodus, honestly. We rarely do in academia.
That's a good point. Brian, I want to loop to you for a second here. Both Allison and Lisa talked about interoperability, and we're using a number of, we being publishers, are using a number of systems that are built by different organizations and are communicating with each other. We've certainly seen submission systems that are now doing more seamless submissions from preprint servers and things moving between these different systems, but a lot of that really counts on sort of the industry standards being followed when it comes to the setup of a new platform. You can use like DTDs for XML of published content, being more or less standardized, and also pulling that metadata out of different systems and sharing them. The open source community that's sort of building alternatives, are they taking these standards into considerations when building the new systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got organizations like the PKP and some very, very API structured. And we're doing a lot of work on the OJS APIs right now to make them much, much more interoperable. Or you see organizations like COCO that are building out open source infrastructure as well. It's all designed to be highly interoperable, and you know, everything we do, for example, at Ubiquity revolves around only using community standards, only using technical standards like JATS, standard metadata, and so forth, because it just makes sense. You can't work with a large range of suppliers and other publishers if you're not interoperable.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's one of the common misperceptions about sort of moving off of a legacy system, is that there's not as much care taken in those standards, and so I'm glad we were able to address that today.
I mean, what you get from a lot of the legacy systems is really very, very difficult to migrate, and yeah, I think most of the new players in the game want to get the opposite to that.
Anyone who's had to move from one platform or another knows that's true, yes. After a major announcement is made that publisher A has purchased vendor B or so forth, that's usually when we start to see the calls flying. So sales reps for the purchase vendor need to make assurances to their customers, and sales reps for every other vendor in that space see an opportunity to make a sale. And regardless, the options have been over a long time feeling like they've been dwindling, and the cost and headache of changing from one vendor to another is sometimes overwhelming. Allison, how is PLOS approaching these concerns?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Angela, and I can't tell you how many calls and emails both I and some of my colleagues had in the weeks after Elsevier announced the Aries acquisition. But as you say, I mean, the truth is that it feels as if publishers like PLOS currently have a pretty limited and honestly not terribly attractive range of options. You know, as we've said, we've only got 7 journals, but one of those is really, really big. And so we need systems that are both robust and fully proven. And you're also right that the change comes with huge switching costs. And so it only makes sense for us to make that change if we're confident that we're moving to something that really is quantifiably better than where we are right now. You know, my sense is that publishers like PLOS occupy a middle tier that isn't well served. You know, if you looked at sort of above us, there are the largest commercials and perhaps some of the largest societies as well, who have the scale to be able to invest in making the existing systems work for them. And then below us, I think there's a long tail of smaller publishers, smaller journals who are well served by, you know, what systems like OJS can offer. And we're sort of stuck in the middle, if you like. So as we look forward to what we can be doing in the future, I think we have to be thinking about doing things differently. Our biggest concern, I think, is really about, you know, the sort of continued closed infrastructure that locks us into, you know, what can end up being high fees that we can't negotiate easily and inflexible solutions. And so I think ultimately, we have to find ways to break out of that and to work with some of these new options. But that also comes with the significant challenges that come with any kind of collective action. And I think, you know, as I look at this, I see sort of 2 real challenges for us. The first is what I'd sort of think about as sort of developing a clear roadmap. You know, Elsevier and other publishers, but Elsevier especially, I think, is clearly making a strong bet that value chain integration is the way to win. And if you look on the nonprofit side, I think one of the observations that stands out most to me is just the sheer number of distinct entities that are trying to innovate and provide solutions in specific aspects of open science and open access in particular. And so the challenge there is, how do we create a clear roadmap and integrate across those systems? Lisa was just talking about that need for everything to play well together. And the second challenge, I think, is developing the sustainable governance and business models. You know, right now, a lot of what's out there is typically grant funded, and I think that can work well for an incubation phase, as it did in the early years of PLOS's history. But ultimately, we've got to be able to develop the business models that can underpin and sustain these efforts over time. I think we're really starting to see some of that emerge at this point through organizations like the Joint Roadmap for Open Science Tools. But that part of it, I think, is still in its relatively early days.
Yeah, I think the funding sources for new entrants in the field is definitely something that we need to watch and see where it goes from there. Lisa, you've written a bit about switching costs as well. What are your concerns about how portable we actually are?
So, I mean, I think this is something where I tend to, think about this more from the individual scholar and researcher perspective. I mean, obviously libraries, if you will, get locked in or have high switching costs for any number of the things that we license. But one of the things that we haven't sort of thought about quite as much yet too is the fact that, for individual researchers, they are typically, moving from platform to platform. And, unfortunately for some of them, as I was listening to a scholar speak this morning about the fact that, they submit to one journal and then another journal, those are different publishers, they're different systems. So in some ways are sort of like, we're putting a lot of switching costs right now, if you will, actually on the individual researcher in order to sort of not have a homogeneity across the entire system. So that's just something that was sort of, on my mind this morning as I was listening to this scholar who was sort of asking for, if you will, a greater degree of uniformity across the, their entire workflow, and then as the librarian and paying attention to this and knowing some of the concerns that publishers raise around, just this, as Allison just talked about, this integrated value chain. So it's clear that libraries experience the same issue with switching costs. I mean, I think that's in part why, while I eventually, expect to see some exit from beepress onto other options, switching platforms for an institutional repository is not something you do overnight. There's moving there's making sure the technical infrastructure is ready, but it's moving all that data, and then it's moving a user community of people who, expect things to work in a certain way. And so there's switching costs that are sort of the obvious ones of like, you have to buy the new technology, deploy it. But there's, I guess what I will say is these social cultural switching costs that are often unaccounted for, but ultimately can be the thing that either, it can actually do in your new product, if you will, or your new technology, because if there's not attention to that social cultural part of the technology, people can just walk away from it, or they can subvert it, or any number of things that are going on. So I can think in my own life of a number of places where there's a support system, if you will, and yet I'm getting emails, right? I think scheduling meetings is a wonderful example of that. Theoretically, we all have online calendars, and yet we have an infinite number of doodle polls and emails going on. So, really thinking through, I think some of these social cultural issues is an important part of any kind of switching cost calculation as well.
Yeah, and that might be actually the harder one to solve, huh?
People are very complicated.
Yes, they are. We are seeing a lot of efforts, as we've mentioned earlier in the webinar, from the community to build software or things like platforms or submission systems. But most publishers, aside from the big commercial houses, don't have the expertise in-house to customize, support, and maintain large software efforts like these. Particularly when you're looking at some society publishers and smaller publishers, the IT department is focusing more on making sure everyone has access to email than they are on how to build a publishing platform. And what these groups need is not open source software, but services built around open source software, allowing them to outsource these efforts rather than having to become technology developers themselves. Brian, you have some experience certainly in this area. How do we go from the community building a great piece of infrastructure to a sustainable community-owned not-for-profit service, putting that software to use on behalf of publishers?
Right. I mean, well, like you say, I think that smart service providers will use open source software, but I think it's whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, I think is a thing. I think it's a mistake to only wish for non-profit solutions for infrastructure and services. Obviously, there's been a lot of trust lost with companies being sold to large legacy organizations that operate in very anti-competitive ways. But I believe that for-profits like us in the long term are very essential because we have to operate in a sustainable way to survive, which ensures our longevity. And being for profit means that you also attract top talent. You're always driven to improve your platform and so forth. So for us, the really key thing is being a for-profit that operates in a community-oriented way, and whose goal is to make the community successful. So, and the key thing there is trust. So we have a customer charter which guarantees the way we will operate. We have boards built from our partners who oversee that. But we're also putting in place rules for who we will and won't partner with or integrate with. And rules like that they should make similar guarantees about future operations, they should be transparent and so on. And I'd like to see more of those types of guarantees of trust being made public. And then we perhaps have a much healthier ecosystem.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the materials for your organization about the governance structure and the guarantees, the customer guarantees. That's a really interesting approach to thinking about who to partner with and who not to partner with. So certainly another space to sort of be watching. Lisa, you've written about in the Scholarly Kitchen and talked a bit today about Lockin, where publishers building end-to-end workflow solutions are hoping to provide sort of a single source workflow for researchers, but it makes it even more difficult then for institutions to walk away from parts of that service. Where the big deals currently refer to bundled journal packages, the big deals of the future may include authoring tools, digital lab notebooks, analytic tools, and data support. What are your concerns about these strategies for the libraries and institutions? And are there any opportunities for institutions that come from this kind of consolidated service like you were hearing about this morning?
Sure. I mean, I think this is, it's interesting when we say like publishers are now building end-to-end workflow solutions. So in other words, publishers aren't publishers anymore. They're workflow platform providers. And I think it's the case that we can very much see this sort of build out, and it's driven by the desire for researchers to have efficient and effective platforms that enable them to do their work. It's very disruptive to the scholarly process to have to move data from one system to another system to another system as you work from data gathering to analysis to results to authoring. So these separated activities that in very recent memory take place in very separated system. I mean, that's a reflection of an analog world where you were capturing data in one way, then entering it. And, so we don't have to live in that world anymore, right? We can gain efficiencies, but those efficiencies come at sort of the cost, if you will, of larger and larger structures. And, you use the phrase big deal here, and I really want to give a shout out to our fellow Scholarly Kitchen chef, Roger Schoenfeld, who in another piece that he's written a lot about Lockin as well and workflow, and did write a piece that really looked at this idea of the new big deal, the big deal of today, which is that these decisions are being made. And I'd like to point out, they're often not being made systematically. It's not, I don't really think a university wakes up in the morning and is like, today we have decided that we will now be a Elsevier integrated workflow shop, or a digital science, or that we're going to go for the Clarivate. I mean, like whatever the suite is, it's a series of decisions that's made over time, and it's decisions that are made by individual researchers, different campus offices, etc. And then, it's a little bit like a web is being, I'm going to mix my metaphors here, like a blanket is being knitted around you, and suddenly you realize that these different pieces are connected in such a way that you didn't ever intend them to be connected in that way. It's not like you chose that, but the effect of your collective choices over time is that sort of lock-in, if you will. And so I can look at my own institution, and it's not hard when you start to say, like, well, what is our current researcher information management system? Oh, we have Pure. Oh, look, we have Scopus. And of course, we know that those tools work together. And eventually you start to see that you've sort of bought into an infrastructure. So it's not unlike in higher education, where by and large, your infrastructure management for your enterprise system on the business side of a university is you're either a PeopleSoft or you're a banner institution. And so now we're seeing this on the research side, this sort of looking across these things, which doesn't mean that there aren't examples or pockets on campus that are using different tools, but that eventually this infrastructure gets built in which things become easier and easier to do within that infrastructure and harder to do outside of that infrastructure. And then eventually we'll see policy layovers that require the use of those centralized systems. It's kind of like a doom and gloom answer.
But now, who at the universities are typically making the decisions to buy into these workflow products? Is the responsibility moving away from the library?
So again, I think we have to say here, did the library ever have this responsibility of buying all the products for workflow? No, we did not. We were licensed the products of research, right? We bought the books, we subscribed to the journals, and then we were responsible for discovery tools and retrieval tools. But we were really sitting as a library, if you will, on both the very end of the research process, as well as, if you'll say, the very beginning of the research process, right? The publishing and the lit review side of things. And then in the middle, you know, for the humanities, because the library is their laboratory as it goes, we were holding those materials, but we weren't in the science workflow. And so what I think is actually shifting is this whole question of that these are not separated activities anymore. We don't see the separation of research, publication, data gathering into such separate tasks. And so, I mean, it's very clear if you're, you know, that platform providers, which I'm intentionally saying rather than publishers, have found that there are markets on campus that are not the library. And in fact, those are the growing markets on campus. And I mean, put bluntly, those offices do not bring to their work some of the values that librarians do. And those librarians' values are often sort of in conflict with some of the platform providers because of our attention to things like privacy and equity and access. And if you don't have those values as your top forefront, you might not challenge some of the practices of some of the platform providers. And I will say this is particularly true when it comes to any part of data analytics and the kind of data that these platforms are increasingly capturing about our researcher and student workflow and the ways they are then monetizing that and driving further lock-in into their products. So one interesting question for me is, you know, if we see the either nonprofit or community-oriented sort of alternative to these very large-scale lock-ins, is there an alternative that locks you in as an institution to that kind of community-driven and open? Or are those community-driven and open infrastructures always sort of inherently vulnerable to the commercial competition that is about scale and profit? Because if so, if we can't, if you will, sort of provide an alternative lock-in, we're going to spend a lot of our time continuously sort of fending off commercial lock-in and never really get the scale on the nonprofit community-driven side.
Yeah, and what you were hearing this morning, it sounds like, was a desire for these sort of workflow solutions, and so that's something that when you're hearing from the community that they want, and if the only options are coming from large publisher platforms, I can see where that would be a concern.
Yeah, I mean, in my life, I carry this title of professor as well as librarian, and you know, there is nothing I want less in my life than minutia of managing the publication and data gathering process. Like, I want that because I'm interested in the new knowledge that I'm creating.
Right.
And so, you know, to the certain degree, I want those systems to seed into the background in the same way that I don't have to think about what does it mean that the Microsoft Office suite is just automatically on every computer I run into on my campus. Like, it just happens.
Mm-hmm.
So, if suddenly there were some sort of manuscript submission system offered to me that's just there all the time and we all use it, that's going to be an efficiency for me that it's going to be hard for any researcher to not want that.
Yep. I'd like to take a little bit of a turn here back to independent and society publishers. Many of the new and emerging options available for infrastructure vendors are specifically designed to support cost-effective models for open access publishing. Brian, do you see vendors in this space someday taking an interest in providing their services to society publishers that aren't strictly open access?
Possibly. I mean, I can't speak for the other vendors. I can say that we absolutely, certainly won't do that. It's completely in opposition to almost all of our core values. So when we were started as a publisher, we just decided that we would be uncompromising about that. It's our belief that closed access as a system is totally in opposition to the advancements of science and society. It's just something we're not going to be involved in. We want to help publishing drive science forward. It's all about enhancing scientific communication, not blocking it. So as a publisher, we think it's antithetical to what we do. And to build trust, you just really have to be all in. So we've had opportunities over the years to pick up quite a lot of closed access business, and in the end we've turned it all down. I think it's at the point now where our staff would mutiny if we went that way. And since we've been talking this way for such a long time, I think a lot of our customers would also mutiny because they really trust us for our open culture. So we're all in believing that the future is completely open access, and we don't want to get distracted by anything closed access at all.
Allison, I wanted to ask you sort of a similar question in a similar vein. Some definitely in the open access community are certainly big fans of PLOS and big critics of commercial publishers, particularly Elsevier. What challenges are present when one of your mission critical pieces of infrastructure is now owned by Elsevier?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this is not where we would have chosen to be. Elsevier's reputation in the OA community is pretty negative. And, having said that, I'm not aware of any direct criticism of PLOS for where we find ourselves. I mean, to the contrary, more sympathy with where we find ourselves. I have heard some questions about why we don't switch to open source community solutions, but, as I've noted, I just don't think that those available are yet where we would need them to be for us to make that decision. I don't have any immediate concerns about sort of our data or what's about to happen to Aries over the next year or two. There's a very clear firewall built into our contract with Aries, and I don't think Elsevier is going to start making unpopular changes for Aries customer base anytime soon. That said, I think it'll be the same until it isn't, and it's less about Elsevier per se and more about the fact that we now have a key piece of our publishing infrastructure owned by and also profiting, a large, arguably aggressive commercial competitor. And so I really worry more about what the situation looks like in 3 to 5 years' time when Elsevier has more fully absorbed Aries into its infrastructure and what that may mean for us. So as we look forward, I think the challenge is to ask ourselves, what can we be doing over the next few years to ensure that there are better choices for us in the future? And, in that case, when our contract is up, that, Brian talked about this a little bit, and there's understandable skepticism of community-built solutions as we don't yet have many success stories to point to in our sector, although I think OJS is a great example of one that is really working well for many in our community. And I think we tend to get a little bit hung up on sort of open source and non-profit. And, I think in many ways that's a mistake. There are successful examples of solution that are either or both of those things. And so for us, it's really about where do we put our resources over the coming years? Which are the models that we're willing to experiment and put resources behind and help scale that development? Because I think without the willingness for publishers like PLOS to do that, nothing's ever going to change. and that there's kind of tangible support, whether it's willing to partner in an experiment, developers, cash, that sort of support from the wider community is the only way that we're really going to build financially viable and sustainable alternatives over time.
Yeah, and that's definitely even, kind of putting the business models aside, even for society publishers or other commercial publishers that are using a specific vendor solution or vendor platform, to now have to be paying your competitors for that same service is a bit of a hard pill to swallow. So, but as you said, the alternatives so far have not really presented themselves in a way that makes publishers feel comfortable in making sort of that big leap to a new vendor solution. I would like to ask, as I'm sort of wrapping up the questions that we have pulled together, that if anyone who's listening has questions, to please go ahead and put them into the question field. I have one here for Allison. So Allison, you said PLOS wouldn't make the choice again to build in-house unless PLOS has clear, specific, unique needs. When PLOS chose to build manuscript workflow tool, that was a calculation that author experience was core to PLOS's business and PLOS's authors had specific needs that weren't being met. How will the next decision like this provide the correct analysis of what is clear and unique?
I think, some of that is still we're still sort of thinking some of that through at the moment. But I think when it comes to some of those big, and I would make a distinction between enterprise-wide solutions, so things like CRM, platform, manuscript workflow, that really are, those are significant pieces of technology to develop. And I think for a publisher the size of PLOS, the investment required in both people resources and in pure money to support those is something that really isn't going to make sense for us over time. Those are the kinds of systems where I think there is more potential for us to work in partnership and coalition with others who are trying to do the same thing. So I think that's where we would focus resources in those kind of areas. When I talk about things that are unique or, sort of add unique value to PLOS, I think they would really be smaller scale and things that we're unable to get somewhere else. So a good example of that from our past is our article level metrics tool. That was long before altmetrics existed. And so I think, sort of that was an opportunity to build something that was important to our mission that wasn't available somewhere else. And so as we think about what kind of development might we do in-house in the future, I think that's a good example of the kind of thing that would make sense for us to continue to build ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a difficult decision to make, and even when moving from one sort of commercial system to another requires an awful lot of investment of time and resources to make that switch. And as many know, different platforms have different requirements of the user of those platforms and the purchaser of those platforms. So even moving from one system that might be fairly off the shelf versus another that's going to be pretty hands-on can be quite shocking to many publishers and partners in the space. Lisa, you have an interesting, one of the reasons I love having you on things is because you're a researcher, you're a librarian, and you're an editor, which gives us the opportunity to ask you all kinds of questions in all of those different areas. So putting your editor hat on, you're an editor of a journal that's owned by a university press. What does the editorial community sort of think about this kind of infrastructure and consolidation? Is this sort of a whatever, just give us the tools that we need, or are there real sort of concerns from a editor perspective on content quality or journal quality around these infrastructure needs?
Yeah, so I'm the editor of Library Trends, and I do have to do this just because it's actually a journal that's owned by a university. and it is published by a university press. So it's actually owned by the School of Information Sciences, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and then our publisher is Johns Hopkins. So it's an interesting journal. I can tell you we actually have no workflow support system in it because it's an unusual journal because it only publishes special issues, and so everything is a guest editor. And so this all gets handled by email. And literal Dropbox transfer when it comes to this. So it's a very different setup. But I think that, you know, by and large, editors themselves have the same pressures that authors do, except writ even larger. And there's clear pain points in the editorial process. I have also edited a journal that had your more traditional sort of manuscripts come in, you send them out for peer review. And I was actually the editor of that journal when it went from being published by a very small independent press to being purchased by Elsevier over a decade ago, like 15 years ago. So, and I can say that the experience of moving one to the other was quite significant to move as an editor from a small independent press to the Elsevier system, even of that time, which of that time meant I was like FedExing diskettes to New York City. So it's not like this was a real automated workflow at that time, but the degree of support was notable. What Elsevier was able to offer to me, I presume because of some scale and because of having sort of a staff that actually supported their editors. And I now know from what I now understand of the scientific editor community, I was actually receiving the very low end of the support that they provide. But I think particularly when we think about the challenges that editors have for finding peer reviewers, this is just such, I mean, it's kind of the reason to not be an editor practically, is the dealing with the peer review question of how do we find peer reviewers? You're hearing editors say that they have to ask 5 people for every one that they actually get to do a review, and then that review is not on time, which of course causes great pain for authors as well. I mean, so anything that is going to help editors in that peer review management process is going to be very, very welcome. You know, something that both workflow wise as well as participation wise.
Yeah, and it does seem like we're not quite there yet with all of the editorial workflow solutions that can happen, but it's certainly getting there. Did you have something you wanted to add, Lisa?
Well, I was just going to say, I think the other thing that we sort of are seeing, and I feel like this is like looking forward a little bit, but one of the things that I think something like, I mean, as I wrote in the piece in the Scholarly Kitchen about Aries and the acquisition there, like I think the concerns that Allison raises, right, and the concerns you've raised about having sort of your competitor now profiting off of a tool that you use in order to, there's like, that's a real issue. But I think if we just sort of step a little bit further out of that, one of the things we can ask ourselves is, because obviously the lifeblood of a journal is the things that are being submitted to it, right? So the sooner you can sort of capture the author's imagination, if you will, that your journal is the place for their manuscript, particularly the better manuscript it is, right? So you can attract that in. So it looks to me that one of the things we should be asking ourselves is not just whether sort of the manuscript and the publication processes software itself, but where that software is positioned relative to the author experience. And that, I think, is where we can start to say, you know, we can look at some of these other consolidation questions, because it's bigger than just Aries, if you will. The publisher independence is also about access to authors. And so it's not just that Elsevier bought Aries, it's that they, as you mentioned, bought beepress. They also bought SSRN. And both of those products push Elsevier much closer to the manuscript creation side of things, particularly SSRN, where you can start to see the potential of a preprint that sort of finds its way into the Elsevier ecosystem, or we see this in other areas developing as well. Like the closer you get to the manuscript, that's where the competitive edge becomes in this process. And that's, I think, where it's going to be even harder for independent journals and smaller journal houses to sort of keep connected with authors unless they are very, very tied to a discipline. So Angela, I think you might be in good shape there.
Yes. You know, Allison, as Lisa was sort of talking about that, I was thinking about bioRxiv and the connections, the close connections between PLOS and bioRxiv, and now CZI as a funder that's sort of you know, supporting bioRxiv, particularly with the new announcement that they'll be paying for XML processing for all of the preprints that go in there. So clearly, this sort of workflow solutions that we're seeing, or this end-to-end workflow that we're seeing from some of the big commercial publishers, seems to definitely be on the PLOS roadmap as well. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, yeah, I think so. And I think just a quick point to follow up on what Lisa was talking about from an author's point of view. I think also from a publisher's point of view, one of my concerns about sort of Elsevier's strategy with the acquisition of Aries is not just about the sort of end-to-end workflow and moving sort of further up the workflow stream, but it's about the data and analytics piece. And, you know, Elsevier's been very clear that that's a big part of their strategy going forward. And so the Aries acquisition must at some level be focusing on the thousands and thousands of papers that flow into Editorial Manager. So, you know, that's a big what if, but I think it's a real one as I think about it. And so, yes, I think that partnering with someone like bioRxiv is a great example of how the nonprofit or, you know, the independent community can work collectively. I mean, interestingly, when I got to PLOS last summer, we were building our own preprint server. And that was another area where we sort of took a deeper dive. And I think the real question there was around what is it that PLOS is interested in doing with preprints? And part of it is about encouraging the posting of preprints. And so, you know, the first stage of our partnership with bioRxiv has done that. But we're now in discussion with bioRxiv about sort of what comes next, because the piece that PLOS has really been interested in is how do you start to change and break down, you know, our notions of peer review and to add other voices into peer review in a different way if you're looking at preprints rather than, you know, the many failed experiments we're all aware of on in post-publication review. So, you know, I think being really clear on what it was we wanted to achieve with preprints helped us think about, you know, how should we approach the infrastructure piece. And equally for other smaller groups or societies or journals, you know, working with something like the suite of preprint servers at the Center for Open Science is going to make more sense. So there are in many cases good community-based options, just not for some of those, you know, the manuscript system I think is still a challenge for all of us.
Yep. All right, we have run into the end of our time. Before we sort of wrap things up, I want to thank Lisa and Brian and Allison very much for participating in this Scholarly Kitchen discussion today. This is a topic that we will continue to see interest and activity in, I am sure, as things move forward. And I also want to thank you all for listening in today and remind you that if you're in the United States, don't forget to vote. And I will turn things over to Jeff.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Angela, as well as Allison and Lisa and Brian, and all of you for participating in the discussion and for sending in your questions today. Once again, please do take time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you will receive over email. Your feedback will help us to continually improve this webinar program. Also, keep an eye out for the 2019 webinar schedule that will be coming soon. With that, we are concluded. Thank you and enjoy your day.